and welcome to Education on Audio Systems for High School Band Programs, specifically marching band and indoor percussion ensembles. So this is going to be a series about everything audio related for these types of programs. And so this first video will be introduction, overview of equipment, cords and cables, and the basics of mixers. So with that said, let's go ahead and start. So for the introduction, hi, my name is Elliot Buell. I graduated from Edgewood High School in 2022. I am currently pursuing a double degree in both audio and music at Vincennes University. I am currently serving as an audio engineer, an audio systems designer, and RF coordinator, as well as a couple other positions for multiple high schools around the state of Indiana. I will be serving as an audio intern in A3, in other words, with the Bluecoats this summer in their 2024 production. So let's go ahead and start fully. Let's talk about overview of equipment. So in this, we'll be talking about a bunch of stuff. One of the stuff is cables. So cables or cords, however you decide to call it, are essentially, you should know this, but connect multiple different equipment to one another. This could be a refrigerator to a outlet, or an outlet to a mixer, something like that. Speaker to an amp, amp to a mixer, mixer to a laptop, you name it. Each one has a use, some more specific than others, and then some may be able to power equipment, send data to equipment, may allow for the control of equipment, and more. And some of them can actually do a lot of these things instead of just one specific purpose. And then next we have wired microphones. So wired microphones are essentially microphones that have a wire on them, and they essentially capture sound and converts it in a way that can be used and transported by electronics, and then typically used by a mixer to edit it and then turn it back into actual audio signal once it comes out of the speakers. So it comes in three types: a dynamic, condenser, and a ribbon microphone. I'll talk more about those, but there are a difference between each one. But we'll be talking about that, I'm pretty sure, in video 2. Each mic is different, each has its strengths, and each have its weaknesses. Each microphone also has its own polar pattern and frequency response. Again, we'll get into this in videos 2 and 3, but you don't need to know that for right now. Wireless microphones. Essentially, wireless microphones are the same as wired microphones, but they send the signal wirelessly. Typically, there's a transmitter and a receiver. So your transmitter would be a microphone, and then the receiver would be the receiver unit, something that usually sits in a rack and gets that signal from your antennas. Most wireless microphones operate in the 470 to 608 megahertz area. Now, you don't need to know about that specifically, but it's very useful to know that that's probably where it sits at. But we'll talk more about wireless frequency and all that later. Mixers. I consider this the most important part of the audio setup. I kind of like to think this as the brain of the audio setup. The mixer essentially allows for the control of audio inputs and outputs. It can adjust the audio signal, as in like it can add EQ compressors, send the buses, send the aux channels. You can do a lot. Gates, name it, it can probably do it. Comes in many shapes and sizes. However, the most common mixer board among high school programs and below is generally the Yamaha TF series and the Behringer X32. Both pretty good mixers, but if you wanted to get more professional, like DCI, they probably wouldn't be very helpful in those scenarios. Next, we move to speakers. Essentially, these speakers receive the audio signal from the mixer or an amplifier and essentially plays it. So it converts that electronic data into sound data. Typically divided into two types of speakers, loudspeakers and subwoofers. Sometimes there's some more, but I'm not going to get into those, because those are the two that you need. And we'll talk more about those later. Speakers are essentially, they just use one or more drivers to create the sound needed. So that's how they turn that data into sound. Moving on. Amplifiers. Amplifiers are typically used after a mixer and before a speaker in the signal path. They typically sit in a rack, and essentially these are used to power passive speakers. But sometimes speakers are active and you don't actually need an amplifier, which essentially, as we're going to talk about later, active speakers just have an amplifier built inside of them. So you don't need to use an amplifier from a board to there. So that's how that works. But amplifiers like rack amplifiers are used to power passive speakers. Wi-Fi. So essentially this is about Wi-Fi routers specifically. They're growing more and more useful in our audio world. We can use them to transmit audio across the world, essentially control mixers and equipment and more, besides providing internet. So you can do a lot with Wi-Fi, and we'll be talking more about that later too. But they are it's very important to a modern day audio setup. And then we have computer and software. Essentially, this is just, obviously you know what a computer is, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to watch this video. So computers allow us to get software such as Logic X Pro, Pro Tools, and Adobe. Essentially, we can use that to edit and record audio signal. And then additionally, we also have software for electronic instruments such as MainStage 3 and Ableton. And essentially, this would be stuff that we use from synths. We can use synths with MainStage, and I did a whole video series on that. You should go check that out. But essentially, MainStage 3, we can use that for the electronic instruments. So synthesizers, timpani, you name it, it can play it. Moving on. Audio interfaces allow us to send and output audio from our computers into mixers. Cords and cables. So this is the next major section we'll be talking about. So first on the list, we have the XLR. This is used for audio purposes and essentially used primarily with microphones and mixers. It is balanced. Now what you need to know about that is that means that you'll have less interference with it as opposed to the next cord, which is a 1/4-inch jack or instrument cable. It can also be called a guitar cable. So essentially used primarily with audio purposes, but is also sometimes used to send data such as sustain pedals and expression pedal data to a MIDI controller. It's primarily used with electronic instruments and mixers. Not much outside of that. And it comes into a couple types: unbalanced, TS, or balanced, TRS. And there's also TRRS, I'm pretty sure, but we don't see those very often. Unbalanced is essentially the unsafe version. Essentially what it is when you think about it, a antenna is just a large rod, really kind of inserted in the air to either send or receive data. And that's what a cable kind of will act like. So you can only make these cables so long before they start to pick up unwanted audio signal. Now, a balanced would be that bottom one on the bottom one on the slide. So the top picture is a picture of an unbalanced or a TS quarter-inch cable, and the bottom one is a TRS cable or a balanced cable. And essentially, the difference between that is the balance is much safer, and it can also send stereo. Moving on. Speaker cable. Now, I just call it a speaker cable. Sometimes I call it a speak-on cable. Essentially, it is a company's idea to build this, and it actually works perfectly well, and we use it everywhere. Used for audio purposes, obviously. They do have a power version of this called a PowerCon. This is called Speak-On. So it can come with 2-pole and 4-pole, and it's used primarily for amplifiers and passive speakers. The 2-pole is essentially, it sends 2 signals on it. 4-pole is 4. So those will be very helpful to know. I would suggest looking that up in your free time. And then we have network cable. So we have like Cat5 versus Cat5e versus Cat6. This is typically used for network. However, it can be used to send audio data. Dante is an example of being able to use this for example, like routing everything to our synthesizers and then using the synthesizers with Dante to send over to the soundboard. That's an example of using Dante and network and all that. So we'll be talking about setups now with this. So setups is essentially, typically instrument mics and audio outputs don't directly plug into the mixer, because usually it's not that simple. So typically cables are organized and set up in a way that improves setup time, makes it easier for students. So for example, this is a picture of one of the school's setups that we designed very, very early on. It definitely changed a lot. But essentially we have a DTX, and we have to get that DTX over to that blue square, right? The mixer. So you would think the easiest way to do that is get the DTX and just plug it straight into the mixer, but you can't do that because there's a bunch of other stuff in the way. It may not look like that on this chart, but there's actually like 5 instruments between the guitar and the rack. So what I did, or what the plan was, because we ended up putting the DTX on the drum set cart, is we put the DTX through to the vibraphone, which goes to the next vibraphone, this goes to the next vibraphone, this goes to the next vibraphone. Oh, sorry. We also added another vibraphone, so that's why I'm confusing. Which would then go to the marimba. We added another marimba, and then that would send via an XLR snake to the mixer. And so if you count that out, the DTX is 1 input, vibe 2, vibe 3, that's 3, so that's 4 right there, including DTX. And then each marimba is 2 because we have 2 mics on them, which we'll talk about later. So we'll send that to the snake and that out. And then we have those 2 other marimbas right there. And then essentially they send to each other and then send to the synths. But in this case, they actually sent to the mixer themselves because we changed it. And we used the Cat5 converter to use that. And then the synths essentially send everything to the mixer. So what I was just talking about is daisy chaining. Daisy chaining is essentially having a chord on, let's say, vibe. That chord sends that audio signal from that vibe to the next vibe over, and then that vibe has 2 cables on it, one for itself and one for that previous vibe, and then that goes over, and that's essentially daisy chaining. So here's an example of the daisy chaining. So if you follow the red would be the DTX. As I said, this is Edgewood. Actually, I didn't say that it was Edgewood. I said it was high school. So this is Edgewood's really early setup diagram for the front ensemble. But essentially, the red, if you follow the red arrow from the DTX over, that'll take you to the mixer, and that shows you kind of what daisy chaining is. So yeah, this just further explains that. Now we'll be talking about mixing basics. This section is mostly video recorded, and we'll be talking about it with a Yamaha TF5 mixer. So in this video, we'll be talking about setting up a channel, pan, EQ, compressors, gates, aux channels, DCAs, effects, and a little more. So this section, we're going to be talking about the basics of mixers. Overall, this section is about essentially the basic operation of mixers, setting up a channel, EQ and high and low pass filters, compressors, gates, panning, aux channels, DCAs, and effects. Of course, this is on our TF5 console. So this is at Edgewood High School. And essentially, we're going to go ahead and start. So I kind of factory reset it. And this is the channel I am using currently to come through. EQ is a little wonky, but no worries. So there's a little to know about what is happening on here. So first off, a little overview of this mixer. Up here, we have our scenes. So if I actually go through, we can see this is our marching band show at Edgewood. And this is our indoor show. So right now I am using my own private scene in B. So this is if I select a select view on a channel, I'm pressing the select button, or the SEL. It's a button that glows green when pressed. On a channel, it essentially allows you to select it. So we can see right here, this is channel 1. So I can press this and I can name it to Mike for my project. And then I can change that. That's really easy. And then we have recall and mute safe. I'll explain more about that. And we have auto mix. I don't use this, but some people do. Essentially auto mix stuff around a certain point. This is the pan, so I can set it to come out one way or the other way. This is on. Essentially, this is allows me to turn on and off the channel. Effects sends right here, FX1, FX2, and this is my aux sends. So you can see I'm coming into aux2, and then finally we have over down here, we have our sends to our essentially our main speakers and DCAs. And then next, on this final row, we have our gain, input gain, and of course, if it's a condenser mic, phantom power and phase invert, EQ and filters, gate, compressor, of course our fader right here. So if I move it on, the board, that comes on. If I press it on there, that comes on. I can also do it here, and I can affect it here as well. So let's go ahead and start with setting up a channel. So if you have a dynamic microphone or a ribbon microphone, it's very simple. You will have that 48V off. So let's start on a new channel. It's dynamic microphone. You turn up the gain to where you need it to be. And then you would also have the 48V if it's condenser mic, and then phase invert is if you need it. Most time in marching band, you don't need it unless you are putting two mics on a snare drum that are opposite of each other. That's when you would need it, because otherwise they would cancel that out. So that's setting up that. Oh, yeah, and then the input, most of the time we use this in marching band, and sometimes we'll use slot. Slot is essentially where you have a device that you plug in your microphone and your cable, and then it sends it from that box to the mixer board. USB is essentially you can send signals from the USB to the, of course, from the laptop to the USB and back and forth. So essentially laptop to the mixer and so forth. So that's what those are. Most of the time we just use XLR inputs. This one's a big boy, so it's got about 24 or so inputs, something like that on the back, or maybe 32. And we never use that much. So we have yet to use any kind of extra version of that. So that's what that one looks like. EQ, pretty self-explanatory. You can disable the EQ and turn on the high pass filter. And then additionally, you can press this top one and select this. And then you have your high cut filter. This is, of course, this can also be called high cut or low pass, while this is a high pass filter and a low cut filter. That's the terminology there. Gate, of course, is if I'm not making enough sound, it will not go through, and you can adjust it, how fast it attacks, how long it holds that, and then decay, how long it disengages itself. Compressor is kind of like a gate, acts in kind of the same way, except it limits your volume when you get over a certain point. Same things, and then you can adjust the knee. So for example, if you look, hard knee, soft knee, hard knee, medium knee, soft knee. So yeah, and then you can adjust the ratio and stuff. So that's what compressor is. And so that's basic overview of this whole board. So next we're going to look at the EQ part. So assuming once you got your mic set up, so let's say we have this, like I'm using my mic right now. This is what my EQ looks like. So this is kind of tailored to this room, and make it sound less dirty in a sense. But essentially, we can adjust it with the, sorry about that. We can adjust it with this. So there's a little knob right down here. We can adjust here, or we can actually drag. So that's our high pass filter. And most instruments don't really get below 100, 125. So that's a very good place to put it. Tubas are an exception. They get down there, but most of the time you're not putting them, you're not really relying on that low part as much. And of course, high pass, we can put that the high cut filter on. So that's how that is. And then, so let's say I disable the high pass filter. See, I can adjust the EQ, and then the Q adjusts the how wide it is in a sense. F is the frequency, and G is the gain. And you can do a lot with that. So that's EQ for you right there. Moving on to gate. Gate is if there's not enough sound being made, then it won't pick up. So for example, let's set it down to -30. And like range is how much do I want to drop it by. For example, this would do almost nothing. Let's say if it doesn't meet the correct, it doesn't go over -30, then it drops it 20 dB. And that essentially means that it will be 4 times softer, because sound is, dB is logarithmic. So essentially 10 dB is actually 2 times softer. And then, 20 dB is 4 times softer. 30 dB is 8 times softer, and so on and so on. So that's important to know. Most time when you have a gate, you need to put an attack above 5, especially on this console, because it can't usually calculate 0, and it starts to distort the sound just a little. Gives it a high twang. So I would suggest at least a 5 millisecond attack. So let's actually show you really quick what that does. So this is my mic coming in. I am coming into Logic. So let me set, so you can see when I'm talking, I'm somewhere right around, probably 50, 40 dB. So let me put this on me right now. And so you shouldn't hear me when I'm not doing anything. When I'm talking above that, now you can hear me, but you can hear I'm cutting in and out, right? So it's, you have to play around with it. So let's increase the hold. Of course, we have to increase the hold, drop the threshold a little. Hello, hello, hello. So when I talk, it starts to pick me up a little more. We go a little lower and we start to pick up even more of my stuff, but all our background stuff is not being picked up. So when I'm not talking, of course, the gate is working. Now, if we bring that threshold too low and we're outside, it will pick up everything, really. So any like small detail, like you can hear me walking around, that's being picked up by the gate. So this is actually important because I actually put gates on our marimbas and vibraphones because we can use those gates to essentially kind of tune out the battery and the horn line when they're doing stuff. So, and the vibes aren't doing stuff. So it allows a little more control. So if I put a -60, you actually can't hear me walking around unless I'm really stomping. If I go to -55, you can't hear me almost at all. So I'm going to stay around probably -60 to play it safe so you can still hear me. And then I'm going to put a hold about 50 milliseconds. It is actually 5% of a second. So 50 milliseconds is 5% of a second. Essentially, I can make it where I have a full second. I can go all the way up to 2 seconds. So here's an example of this. Talk. And you see it takes a while to engage. So that's an example. I typically leave them somewhere around 50 to 300. That's just me. Um, for the sake of clarity, I'm going to keep it at 200. And in decay, I'm going to probably, is how fast that essentially it disengages. So watch. See how fast that it's going and disengaging? Now I'm going to make it go faster. I mean slower. And you're going to see that it goes down much slower. Typically, I have this close pretty soon. I may do this. So it essentially closes pretty fast. I think I will stick with this because this is pretty good. Of course, we can see attack, how fast it opens. So this is going to kind of distort my voice. This is me talking, 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 talking. This is with 120 millisecond essentially delay, and you may be able to hear it. But yeah, it's 120 milliseconds later opening it. So personally, I keep it at 5 because that's, I think, a pretty good number, and you can barely hear that. So that's what that does. Range is how much I decrease it by, if I haven't said that already. That's gates. Gates are really useful on everything in marching band. Moving on, let's go to compressor. That's not compressor, that's FX. The compressor is essentially keeps the same
allows you to adjust how much the sound increases after it crosses a certain threshold. So you can see I'm coming in around probably negative 50, negative 40, somewhere right around there. Adjust it down to negative 50, and you can actually see it's actually working now. So it's gonna be harder for me to get louder from this. So like, this is me talking normally. This is me shouting in front of the mic. This is literally me looking down at, looking straight up at the mic that I'm using to record myself and talking straight to it. That's an example. I can essentially make it where once it crosses that threshold, I don't get any louder. So this is me yelling essentially. It's still probably about the same. Right. So this is pretty good for like, I like to use it for guitars or possibly synths just as a backup in case. Attack is the same way, release is the same way, and out is the same way. Sorry, not out. Out gain is essentially how much you bump it up by. And then knee is also out, like around that area right where the threshold is, how it affects. Does it just immediately happen or does it slowly ease into the process? And we can see that with a curve. So this is a smooth curve, curve, medium curve, and a soft curve. But this is like a hard rounded point at this point. So that's what that is. Now, one knob is just one way you can control it. I don't ever use that because I don't need to. So that's what compressor does. Now, so going back to EQ, and turn off the compressor, we'll keep the gate on. Going back to EQ, we can see, I can adjust my stuff. So this is my actual voice without everything. I'm putting a lot of filtering on it. And this is what I'll probably end up doing in the thing, but this is my raw voice essentially going into my laptop from the essentially the soundboard to my laptop. So I'm putting high pass filter on, get the lows out because I'm not really down. I'm not that low. So, and then I'm just putting EQ on to get rid of that freaking high stuff, all that high stuff. And you can see it work too. So EQ should be really easy. So that's EQ. And of course, we've gone over compressors, gates. Now we're going to go over panning. Panning's really easy. If I move it to the right, I'll only come out of the right. If I go to the left, it'll only go out of the left. Essentially, that will be work. So like in theory, if you have headphones, you may not be able to hear me very well if I have it set to stereo. I don't think I do have it set to stereo. So check. And I don't have it set to stereo right now coming out because it's just not working that way. So I don't want to do that. So overall, that's how panning works. Panning is just essentially side to side. Pretty good. Next we get to aux channels. This is where it gets a little harder to understand. So aux channels, we can essentially send this to aux. So I can send, my mic to aux 2. Free is just before everything, or as if it sends the altered signal. And of course we can turn it on, and off, and such. We can send it to all these aux channels. And we can send it to our sub down there too. That's how aux channel works. Then we can use our aux channels. We can adjust it. So listening in the aux 2, you can see there's a little input coming in from there. This is aux 1, aux 2. You can see I can send from, and that's how that works. I can further put another EQ on it, and then essentially a graphic EQ, if I'm correct in that. and then the compressor, and then you can see where it's sending out. So I'm sending on the back, the second output is aux2. So if I plugged in a speaker into output 2, you'd be able to hear what's coming out of aux this right now. So that's how an aux channel works. Kind of like a layer above that. So going back, our original view. We're almost done. DCAs. DCAs are essentially another way to control stuff. So on here, DCAs. So I can adjust it. So it's actually pretty cool because I use this a lot. For example, let's say channel 2, 3, 4 are vibraphones. 5, 6, 7, 8 are marimbas or something like that, and 9 to 10 are marimbas as well. You can really do a lot. So like this is my vibes. So I can essentially mute my vibes or adjust my vibes overall. And it's really useful. You can assign each one. So I use them quite a lot. Show an example of a picture of it here in a minute. And so of course, so it's pretty useful. It's the control of multiple things. So our original view. Now we go to effects. Now Marching Man, we don't use this as much. At least I don't, and I know most people don't. So effects is essentially I can adjust how much I send. So you won't be able to see this happen, but like this is me coming into a reverb 4, and you can see there's some input right here. I mean output. So this is kind of like a reverb sound. And then of course it goes to the reverb channel and that affects it. So we can affect our things. So like I can put chorus on. Sometimes I'll use that for solos. Other than that, I don't really do much. So that's effects right there. And finally, we're going to get to this. This is the big area. So I only use this a lot, but you can assign the channel to a DCA. So 2 I assign to DCA 1 and 2. And you can also affect mute groups if enabled. Right here, this is stereo. So like this is essentially your main speakers output. So it's now not going to come out of your main speakers, but it's just going to come out of your subs if this is up. So most things I have the sub disabled, except for bass guitar and synths. Synths come out of the subs because, they have all that low sound, and same thing with the bass guitar. I very rarely put field mics through because feedback issues and stuff like that, and wind. So this means I'm coming out of both, and this means I'm just coming out of the main. So that's what that is. So I'm sure you've been seeing what the recall safe is, and that's just another way, like I go in. Recall safe is essentially when I change scenes, which is this. Let me show you. Create another one. Have it be 2. It's literally the same exact thing. So let's go and set, but during this scene, EQ's got its high pass filter on and it's all the way up here, right? And we're going to save that to here. So that's the difference between these two scenes. This is the second scene. And this is the second scene. I just need to be sure really quick. Actually, what's going to happen is the one before doesn't have my mic settings saved in the session. So let's say I want to keep my stuff similar. I can adjust this recall safe. So I have safe on, and let's say I want to keep everything the same. Even though my settings are different on the first one, still it will still override. So for example, you're not going to hear me talk. Let me turn recall safe off. And now I'm going to actually load the scene and you won't hear me at all. So you can see that it wasn't working. So that's what recall safe does. It essentially transfers stuff over. And mute safe is essentially, even though I have it input muted, it will still play and come through. So that's kind of what that does. So that's the understanding of the basics of a mixer. So you have your settings. Omni out is the outputs on the back. And then you have user defined controls. So like on this board, there are 6 controls that I can set stuff to. Custom fader bank is, I can put where I want the faders. The custom slot area. And save and load is loading files. Preferences, of course, is just kind of settings. Setup is, the bus setup. Setup is only for when you really have a slot, but we don't have a slot or a card in our thing, so it's not going to work. That's what that is. So if you ever need to connect it to the Wi-Fi, it's that's the network. Essentially, that's how you would get into the Wi-Fi, as you would see that. So that's that. Thank you for watching, and that's that. Thank you.
Thank you. That's the end of the video. If you have any questions, please reach out to my business email at buellaudio@gmail.com. Thanks again.